So thanks. So we wanted to really go back to the ethics of community engaged research. I'm kind of real brain shift right now. So, so I'm aware of that cognitive shift we're asking you to do now. So let's get away from the policies and let's go back into our communities. And the way we wanted to do this is just really start. There have been many questions over the last few days about what is it, how do you do it, what are the best practices, and even though that's not really the purpose of sort of the specifics of the how-to, we really want to start there as just a base to then elicit the ethical sort of challenges and questions. So that's kind of how we're going to do it. I'm going to start with a few slides. I'll come back to the chair. We'll turn on the light. Erica will really lead us through some of those ethical question discussions. So just wanted to get us through a little bit about what is it, why are we doing it, and apologies if this feels repetitive for some folks, but just wanted to really go back that why is there an interest in community engaged research? Why? Because there wasn't for a very long time. It really has been coming around, and now it seems like it's almost everybody wants to talk about it, but people are saying, how do you do it? So really, some of it started recognizing there were social determinants of health, like that this is important, that there was this continuous gap between science and practice. It's like, if we're creating things but we're not actually understanding how they apply in the community. Calls for community relevant science, like why are we, who are we speaking to, as we've been saying? Are we just speaking to each other as researchers? What is the purpose? Really, the need to address health inequities, and how are we learning about what are the pathways, as we talked yesterday, to that. The continued underrepresentation. Now, in California, BIPOC's been very popular, so it's used here. We had discussions about language in research, sustained mistrust, distrust of research by communities most in need, and the potential for greater impact of science when you have more science literacy of our community organizations or partners, and more community literacy by health researchers. So really understanding that both are experts. And I used to always put a slide up where I had the train that you're riding, and depending on which side of the window you're looking at, you see a very different vision. And I see those as community on one side, science on the other, and it's really, you're trying to all go in the same place, but you have a very different perspective, and if you don't share those perspectives, you're missing a side of the journey. Barriers, serious barriers happen in gaining scientific information by communities, and when I talk communities right now, I'm talking about the agencies, not the individuals, just to be clear, because people go to different places with the word community. Again, limited understanding perhaps of what science and research mean for their work and the health of their communities that they're serving. The experience with researchers has often fostered this mistrust and poor relationships. For those of us who have worked in medical center research centers, most of the communities surrounding that have very negative feelings about the institutions. The sense that researchers are more interested in their professional advancement than in improving the conditions where they're coming in, and that they're being used, collecting information with no return, no shared credit. These things have been going on for a very long time, and it's very sad to know they're still happening. So what is community engaged research? A meaningful collaboration between the researchers and community leaders to address community needs. And I say that broadly. It could also be a relationship, again, with the community itself, but right now talking about potential collaborations, as you've been asking. It's an interdependent, mutually beneficial. Now think about this in any of your relationships. What does that mean? And where there's good communication, negotiation, and how to come to your common goals. No different than another relationship. So really just remembering that. The other thing, though, that I say to people is, if you don't know this, there are two definitions to the word collaborate. One is to work with others, but the other one is to cooperate with an enemy that has invaded one's country. Okay? So, and that's typically or often what many of our communities feel about the researchers who are coming in. And so just, I always like to emphasize that. And so I talked to you about the Mort syndrome yesterday. This is a term that I had developed in the early 90s, or early 90s when I, left my community clinician job and joined the academy. And I had been that community agency, and so now I was on the other side, and I was a scientist, and these were the things that we all, as the community agency, we struggled with, and now as the researcher, I had to struggle with, which was, what is this sort of mistrust, distrust, difficulty? What is sort of behind some of it? And basically from that, we sort of developed this notion of the Mort syndrome, just to be, give it sort of a name that really is defining the negativity, the things that come in and really can destroy the relationships that you're trying to build. And so money, right? I'm going to start with money because we've been talking about its root in inequities. You have this highly funded research situation versus an impoverished community-based organization or NGO, where just even the definition of money is so proportionally distant that they see budgets, they might see pieces of a budget and are like, well, wait, we're only getting this, and you guys are getting $2 million, and we're getting, thank you, $200 for helping us. Right, so things like that. Ownership, we've been talking about ownership at all different levels. Who owns or makes decisions before, during, and after the work is completed? And the dissemination needs may differ significantly. So a lot of researchers would be, I can't share the data with my community partner because they're going to say what we found, and I have to protect that before my journal article is out, 5 years later. And it's like, well, wait a second. How is that possible when it's really this partner that has co-led this with you, that you would feel that you're the owner of that information? And again, in making certain decisions, all of my research was done in the community, and the practicality issues of creating, rigorous science, the protocols in real-world settings, really required an ownership exchange of what do I need to do differently in my research protocol that can retain the rigor, but actually acknowledges what it means to be approaching somebody and ask them to complete a survey in the middle of a waiting room, or what does it mean to ask one of your nurses to do secondary sort of extraction of data from medical records, or what does it mean, you can think of a whole variety of examples. And so the rigor, a lot of agencies would say, why do I need to do it that way, and why do I need to do it that way, the same way all the time, right? So even explaining why, for their understanding of why they would want that too, right? Rather than making it, I want it because I need it because that's how we do science, which is what a lot of researchers might say, as opposed to you and I, us as collaborators, want to make sure that the information we're finding is the correct information. And they want that as much as we do if we want to do the we-they, just to give that example, but it's the us, right? So really emphasizing that. And then time. Our time frames are so out of proportion from, if you work in a community setting, every minute counts. And in research, it's like, 5 years is just the time of our research project, and then maybe there's even another 2 or 3 years after that where we're still publishing off of that data. So this time frame, you really need to think about what are things that really we should be giving our collaborators as we're learning, really, before, things that are uncomfortable to us as scientists, but that are so incredibly useful at the ground level as we're learning them. So that's kind of the general syndrome that we talked about. And then you all asked, what are the spectrum of engagement? What are the types of engagements and kind of roles that you might have? And again, I think, Erica brought up, her example of, the problem solving. Just what are the problems that we should be researching is something we rarely do. And we had a project at San Francisco State where we were asked to be the health line of community redevelopment. They were rebuilding all of the public housing in San Francisco. And these are large, multi-generational housing units that have been in disarray for many, many years. And we decided to ask them what their health priority needs would be, to then try to get the redevelopment funding and the private funding to respond to those needs when they're building the new infrastructures. And we would have never come up with some of the things that they prioritized. They prioritized art, for example, art for health. And we're like, what do you mean? Well, it turns out there are tons of artists living in public housing who have no space to do their art, to see art as healing, to have artists in residence. These are things that they asked for in the rebuilding of their communities. And part of it is that we see public housing as a temporary housing. These are multi-generations of families that have lived in these same locations. So knowing what problems are needed by the community is a critical function. And again, I'm saying this to you in terms of how in the future you might do data, is to think about, if you have a particular area of interest, finding out what your community feels about, is that really relevant and important to them. But again, these are, as you see, I'm not going to go through all of these, but you can go from the initial sort of, putting even before here, what's the problem, to initial formative, to initial informal input, to actually helping with recruitment, generation of the questions and ideas, data collection, grant writing, analysis, dissemination. And then what roles? Community is going to be involved as your participants, as your advisory members, as consultants, collaborators, co-researchers, co-authors. All of those roles are available and legitimate, and I'm sure you can come up with more. Again, the benefits. It brings together all of these things that really can accelerate. As we talked yesterday, we need to accelerate our scientific knowledge to address injustices and differences in health. Promoting these partnerships so that we do study the right things in the right way for the right individuals, and that it's accessible to all of them. And really transforming the perception that researchers and community members are different, apart, separate, when we want to jointly generate knowledge, rather than, again, the notion that the academy is the originator of knowledge, and the community is the recipient. It's a very oppressive sort of design. And again, quickly making best practices. You should be making relationships now, no matter what your research might be in the future. Are there people, agencies, that you think at some point you might want to work with? Like, who are the important agencies in the geographic area where you think you might establish your research career? Go meet them, go talk to them, ask them what they're doing, what are they interested in, what are the issues they're confronting. I mean, it's again, it's building relationships. In some places have established these networks of both community leaders and researchers to just meet monthly and hear about what's going on, and sharing with each other interests and commitments. And again, just finding ways to devote time together outside of the formal kinds of ways in which we do, and have these frank communications about these relationships, so that they know that you really are legitimate in what you're trying to do. And then defining those roles and responsibilities. Decide what those are between the institutions, defining the roles, who's making the decisions, having MOUs. You guys discussed that. Yeah, a little bit. Really important to write those MOUs and go back to them regularly to make sure that you're both sort of still feeling that that was the right agreement. And recognizing that you have to approach our partners with humility about, if you feel that they have something that they need to learn, and knowing that it's not their responsibility for them to teach you everything you should know about the community, because we put that burden on them. Well, tell me, what do I need to know as a researcher? It's like, that's not their job. But you should really ask them what you do need to learn, and then find their suggestions with how to do that. And then again, navigating those differences. Play, because there are social identities and differences that that are hard, and you have to keep those in mind, the power differentials, the historical reputation of exploitation. Asking our partners to do stuff that they just don't have the bandwidth to do. And how are we going to deal with that? Are we going to give them the resources and tell them that those resources are temporary, right? The issue of going in, coming out, sharing resources as much as possible, and going to them. We often ask our cabs to come to our institution for our meetings. Why are we doing that? Why? We're making that, it's our comfort, it's our we're not like, no, we should say, what would you prefer to do? Because some people do want to come because they've never been inside and they want to know what it looks like, or just, whatever, you get the point. Just keeping in mind that we don't think about some of these simple things that make a huge difference. And then, the access to the data. I mean, we're talking about that right now, about who gets access, but for the community, I can't tell you the number of times. Here in New York, there was in the beginning of the epidemic, there was just so much anger at how information was being retained from community-based organizations about what was going on by the researchers who were studying sexual behaviors, et cetera, and they were like, look, we're trying to create interventions. If you're not telling us what you're finding, how are we supposed to really meet the needs of the people we serve? And then, again, try to find other reasons to partner pretty quickly if this is your first work with them. Is there something else we can do together? And certainly involving them in writing and dissemination processes so that we have an accurate representation of data. And I'm going to stop there, but that's sort of just making sure we're all on the same page about what we're talking about when we talk about community engaged research. And folks have asked, is there a specific manual guideline? And I say no, because every community is different, but these might be some of the basic things to think about.